Okay, Brad Schoen, Director of the Police Department. Happy to be back. The last time I looked, the last time I was here was 2010. So that's been a while. If you were here in 2010 and you remember what I had to say, raise your hand. Oh, come on now. And remember what I had to say. Yeah, you told me you did. Okay, all right.
All about going to the BS. Sort of.
Yeah. Vern coached my daughter for years, so he insults me all the time. So if you weren't part of the club in 2010, anybody? Okay, so we're going to do, what I was asked to talk about was sort of maybe give you an update on some of the things I'd introduced last time, because if you'll recall, I was taking you through kind of some of the changes we were going to go through, what our philosophy was, that sort of stuff. So I'm going to hit that real quick, and then I'm going to talk about where we ended up by virtue of some of those changes. So that's kind of the big picture of today's discussion. You know, you told me to hit the forward key, but I have no idea where it is. This one?
So you can use the right and left.
Oh, that one. Okay. Right and left.
The tiniest ones.
The tiniest. Mission statement. When I took over the PD, I looked at our mission statement. It was about that long on an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. I read it and I said, what are we supposed to do with that? That's a bad sign if the guy running the place doesn't know, because it really wasn't really a point of emphasis. So we talked to all the employees. We said, hey, what do you think we ought to be about? What do you think we ought to do? We had mandatory meetings. They all had to come. And we spent about 6 months as a command staff, myself and 5 commanders, there's 7 of, and the assistant director, 7 of us, talking about what our mission statement had ought to be, and we came down to this: to reduce crime and improve the quality of life for the citizens we serve. It's succinct, it's easy to remember, it's etched in the glass on the front and rear entrances of the building to make sure all the employees see it all the time. We give them a little coin, kind of a military takeoff challenge coin. They got to carry it with them all the time at work to remind them of that. It's a point of emphasis for us. It guides what we do. That's what mission statements are for. And so this is the one we adopted. But a mission statement doesn't mean anything without a policing philosophy. Now, there are a number of philosophies out there about policing. It goes back to the 50s. In fact, policing is a well-researched subject. Sociologists love to study it. I graduated a degree in sociology. The reason I got into policing is because I was terrible at the math, so I knew I was going nowhere with sociology. But I remember some of that stuff, and they study it everywhere. Some of those studies started prominently in Kansas City back in the 50s. Anybody ever heard of the broken windows theory? Yeah. Take care of the little stuff, start dealing with the little stuff as it pops up, and you don't have to deal with the big stuff. What that led to eventually in the 90s, some 40 years later, was kind of the, what should I call it, the Rudy Giuliani zero tolerance policy sort of thing that happened in New York. Works pretty darn well to suppress crime. Tends to hack a lot of people off, but it works pretty darn well to suppress crime, as they proved in New York City. So there have been various iterations of policing philosophies. In the 80s, anybody heard of community policing? Yeah. Big deal, right? Yeah, I mean, it's everywhere. We don't do that. That's not what we're doing. But it's still talked about a lot. The problem with community policing is it's kind of a siloed structure. There's somebody in charge of this program, somebody in charge of that program, somebody in charge of this program. And the trouble with silos is there's not a lot of communication between them. So the other problem with community-oriented policing is it can be nothing more than a series of programs without an overall commitment to any particular purpose. As long as people feel good about the police department, that's good enough, as opposed to what we adopted, which is a measurement of outcomes. So, again, a good thing, but maybe not the be-all and end-all that everybody thought it was back in the 80s. Then comes the 90s, the turn of the century, and the latest theory breaks. Now, we'll see how long it lasts, but at this point, it's got some adherence and it's gaining traction. Started over in Great Britain and then moved to Canada. They have nationalized police forces there and everything's controlled from a national level, so they had plenty of money for research. And it's known as intelligence-led policing, IOP. The question that begs is, what is it? So, there's a whole lot of verbiage there. Just focus on the red stuff, because that's the pertinent part. Managerial philosophy that uses data analysis, which is pivotal to facilitating crime and problem reduction and targets prolific and serious offenders. Any of that sound familiar? Facilitates crime and problem reduction. What we just talked about with our mission statement. So it was lifted from the philosophy, reworked a little bit, but generally speaking, we recognize this is the direction we wanted to go, and so that's how we ended up with our mission statement, which sort of also describes our philosophy. But the question that begs is one of implementation. How do you target prolific and serious offenders? There are 2 things that research shows work. 1, places. Target geographic areas where crime occurs, and we've had a number of examples of that. And interestingly enough, in 2013, and I don't know if any of you saw it in the paper, there's a little article on it. I thought it merited a whole lot more press, but that had to do with RCPD winning an ICP Excellence in Policing Research Award. That's kind of a big deal. If you look around at the organizations that have won that ICP Research and Policing Award, there ain't nobody our size that's done that. And what we did was we worked with K-State and Dr. Susan Williams over there in the sociology department and developed a program, a concept around which we structured some tests to determine whether or not it was possible for us to actually reduce crime in certain areas, and the crime we picked was vehicle burglaries. And it showed the results of the research after a year showed that we did in fact reduce vehicle burglaries. Interestingly enough, we didn't just relocate them. It's not that crooks quit committing burglaries where we were doing what we were doing, they just didn't happen. And it also showed, and this was one of the other questions we wanted to ask, is when we administered the treatment, and the treatment, by the way, was 15 minutes in about a square block area once a day, twice a day, by officers in an area where geographically we had determined there were vehicle burglaries. We also had half our officers get out and tool around and walk around and maybe write some parking tickets or whatever else they came across when they were there, and the other half just sat in their cars. You know what we figured out? They didn't have to do anything. All they had to do was sit in their cars. And it had the effect of reducing vehicle burglaries. Now, that's good and bad. The burglaries went down. The bad part is we had to convince guys to get out of the cars anyway. But I think we finally won that battle. But this stuff works, and if you take the time to research it and figure out what it is you want to measure and engage someone who has the skill set to help you measure it, not only do you measure it, you get some national recognition for it, and that's what happened in 2013. So this is just one example of a path we're committed to following, and that is trying to figure out what the problem is, figuring out what you can do to address it, and then figuring out whether what you did worked, and if so, institutionalizing it, and if not, move on to something else. That's the nature of intelligence-led policing. So that's one focus. The other then, uh-oh, hit the wrong button. Oh, now I don't know what button to hit. Let me try this. Okay, oh, there, no, you try. That didn't work.
Didn't work.
It's not me. I'm just.
There you go. There it is.
Okay. There we go. The other one is target the people. 20% of your criminals commit 80% of your crime. Pretty well researched fact. So if you're going to do something to reduce crime, you go where the crime is and you go after the people that are committing. We talked about that last time. There's a whole lot of examples in the ESC courthouse tire case. It just happened over the weekend. And interestingly enough, there's a guy who blows through town every once in a while that we know, and we've come to know him by virtue of our crime analysis function, which I'll get to in a little bit. He suffers from some mental health issues, sadly. But when things don't go the way he wants, he tends to lash out, and invariably he ends up in trouble with the cops, and he's been in our jail on several occasions. Well, he blows into town again the other day. He's looking for some place to crash overnight, and he picked the hotel down, oh, it used to be the hotel. Wareham. All I could think of was Marriott. Thank you. Picked the Wareham downtown. And that lasted until somebody noticed him and he was asked to leave, and this upset him. And within about 60 minutes, there were 50 tires cut over at the, punctured over at the, largely around the county parking space north of the courthouse back into that. Well, the guys come in and crime analyst takes a little bit of a look at the information. He's like, oh yeah, this looks like so-and-so blew into town. This happened the night prior, then the tires were cut. So everybody's looking for this guy today, and I happen to be back in the sergeant's office with the supervisor and lieutenant talking with them about something else that came up over the weekend. And I see both their eyes jump up like this, and they just start ignoring me. I'm like, okay, what just happened? And they say, well, we just got him. I said, what do you mean? The TV screen on the wall in there has all the calls that the officers are being assigned to and which officers assigned to which call, and they saw a call come in about somebody being at the county building on the second floor causing a problem, and the description was that he was wearing a camouflage coat, and they said, that's him. I said, how do you know? They said, because he always wears a camouflage coat. We know him. We'll go. So they went down there and they picked him up, and lo and behold, we figured out who, cut the 50 tires. But why does that happen? I mean, everybody's got their frequent flyers, but how is it they had all that information to know as soon as that call flipped up there, that was the guy they were looking for? And the answer to that is the crime analysis function. So there are a myriad of possibilities here. We had in early 2015, we had a series of vehicle thefts that started happening. It's unusual for Manhattan. We don't have many vehicle thefts here. And the ones we have usually end up somewhere else in Manhattan. They just take them for a joyride. Or, in the bottom of the lake, or not the bottom, but at the bottom of the boat ramp in the lake because they decided to ditch it there. Apparently, every crook understands that that's how the cops never find them. This is where we go look for them. But these were unusual because the cars weren't showing up. We're like, what's up with that? And then we get word that there's a few of them showing up in Topeka. And we find out that we had a guy from Topeka in our jail who was known for stealing cars. And these were particular types of cars. They were Dodge pickup trucks of a certain year where you can pop the ignition and start them pretty easily. And there's a specific technique you use to do that. Well, once we figured that out, we're like, well, he's not here. He's back in Topeka in jail. Well, when he was here in town, we figured out who he was running with in the jail, who he was talking to, and he taught those guys how to do it. Now he had locals doing it and stealing the trucks after they stole property and using the trucks to take the property to Topeka and hawking the property and the trucks while they were down there, which is how parts of them were showing up in various places. How does all that happen? How do we figure that out? And the answer is data analysis again. If this table is watch 1, midnights, this table is watch 2, days, and that table is watch 3, swings, and all of you have various iterations of this theft going on, and you're working 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, what are the odds that that guy is going to run into this guy who will talk to that person, each of whom independently work these thefts? Well, it's pretty slim, and that's what we figured out the hole in our process was. So, once we figured out how to plug that hole with the crime analyst, this is the guy who goes into the computer system and pulls all this information out for us and puts it in a usable format. So, it's more than just the tire case. Oh, almost hit the wrong button again, sorry. So what's new since 2010? Well, the laser point initiative that we talked about a little bit, by the way, award-winning laser point initiative that we talked about a little bit, that's good stuff. One of the other things about intelligence-led policing is when you find good stuff, you institutionalize it. We're still doing that. Well, okay, what does that mean? Well, we know it suppresses vehicle burglary, so in essence, what we're saying is we're probably still suppressing vehicle burglary. It's a little tough to always measure what doesn't happen, but that's one of the things we're doing. The intelligence unit is new. I've talked about it. This is a guy who got his start working in Iraq trying to figure out where they were going to next plant IEDs beside the road. You want to talk about some pressure. He likes this job a lot better. He got out and he went to work for some grand high mucky muck intelligence organization in the DC area and just didn't like the DC area, and we managed to snag onto him. It's kind of an unusual step for a police department our size. In fact, when we started looking at the possibility of doing this sort of thing, we sent the assistant director and one of the captains down to Florida to 2 agencies who were doing the same sort of thing. Both of them were 400 and plus line officers. I mean, they were 4 times our size. But we took a look at it and said, you know, we think this has got some merit. Brought it back, talked to the law board about it, and got some budget money to hire a civilian contractor. He works for Bear Analytics. This is what they do. They're an intelligence analyst firm, among other things. And he works for us. So he's the one who pulls all that data out. And then we have scheduled a series of meetings with him that occur every other week, where we get the captain of the investigations and patrol division together, along with the people who control the boots on the ground, the lieutenants from the 3 shifts we talked about, and then they take a look at what's happened over the last couple of weeks, who are the likely suspects, where are the likely locations, what time of day are they occurring, who's going to take charge for fixing that, who's going to take charge of fixing that problem, figuring out what the issue is and figuring out how to deal with it, and getting the boots on the ground to go after it. And then they come back 2 weeks later and report on what they did and whether they had success or not, and maybe get some additional guidance from the crime analyst as to, you know, things that might modify what it is they're doing. So the intelligence unit is kind of a big deal, but it's not something you hear about on a regular basis. And quick disclaimer, this is not an intelligence unit in the terms of, who's the guy that wrote all the big spy novels, you know, Tom Clancy. We're not talking, you know, Black Ops and Wet Works here. This is data analysis stuff. That's all he does. He sits all day, looks at a computer, uses all that miscellaneous data we enter to try to figure out who's affiliated with whom, who's associated with whom, what are the criminal groups, and who can we go after, and what's the best way to do that. We also tried to do a domestic violence repeat offender program in keeping with the intelligence-led policing. Now, there are some things you can get a fairly quick handle on, street level type stuff. Vehicle burglaries, they occur out in the open. I mean, that's where people park their cars. The cops can be there and see that, and, you know, that sort of thing. Domestic violence is a horse of a different color. It occurs indoors. You know, a lot of times out of sight or view of the cops. We have no right to be in there. So how do we do that? Well, we figured out that there are serial domestic violence victims and there are serial domestic violence abusers. So we tried to develop a program to apply some pressure to the abusers that had to do with the frequency and the type of contact we had them, and was based upon whether or not they were a repeat offender. The more you repeat, the more serious the contact, and after 3 contacts in a year, our goal is this, to put you in jail or prison. And we tell them that. Didn't make any difference, by the way, it didn't work. So we measured it for a year, domestic violence actually went up a little bit. But in keeping with the tenets of ILP, we dropped it. If what we try and what we devote resources to doesn't make any difference, then there's no point in pursuing that. It's not that we're not interested in domestic violence, it's just that particular program didn't work. So we're gonna have to retool it and figure out if we wanna take another shot at it, and if so, what that other shot looks like. Ferguson has changed everything for us, quite frankly. And this is a bit of a sidebar to the ILP discussion, but within the context of intelligence-led policing, it's possible to create the impression that you're still doing those 90s zero tolerance sort of policing things. That technique still exists. And that's one thing we have to guard against. There are a number of ways to do that, and you see the FIP reference that has to do with fair and impartial policing. We've kind of led the crowd and been right at the forefront of the state, if not the nation, when it comes to implementing anti-bias training in our officers to make sure that they're doing the right things for the right reasons and are self-aware enough to recognize that everybody has bias. This is just a question of how you deal with them on both a personal and a professional level. So that's going on, and that may merit some questions if you guys want to go down that path, but it's a little bit peripheral to FIP, but I thought it at least merited mention here. And finally, we have a community advisory board that I think was just getting cranked up. I think it was just getting cranked up about 2008. Now the community advisory board on which Scott sat for a while, and maybe somebody else in the audience, I don't know, I'm just looking around trying to catch faces, does a couple things for us. One, it's an ear to the community. These people understand that there's about a dozen of them. Their mission is to have their ear to the ground if they hear something going on out there that they think we need to know about. Not crime, just community input, demeanor, response to some of the things we're doing. If you're going to be doing that ILP stuff, you want somebody with an ear to the ground to tell you if things are heading south or not, and that's one of their functions. The other, frankly, is to be a bit of a mouthpiece for us and explain things, because they now know, by virtue of being on the community advisory board and hearing what we're doing and why, and knowing what the goal is and where it's happening and exactly what we're doing, so that if they're out in groups like this and hear discussions, they can say, well, here's the skinny. I know this because, and then bring those concerns back to us to help us deal with those. So that's good stuff. And by the way, we're always looking for people who are interested in that. If you have some interest, call down to the office and leave your name. We fill between 1 and 3 slots every year. We have a dozen slots on rotations. So it's usually between 1 and 3 every year. Quick add. So the real question is, does it work? And here we go. Oh, shoot. Wait, got it. Okay. Doesn't work. What you're looking at here are Part 1 crime totals. Now, Part 1 UCR, Uniform Crime Reporting, totals count these sorts of crimes: murder, rape, robbery, assault, batteries, larcenies, vehicle thefts, arsons. The big 7, I know I named 8 because sometimes they count arson, sometimes they don't. It's federal. That's why they call it the big 7, but they have 8. And these are just raw numbers. Now, you'll have to forgive me because this is really small. I'm going to have to look directly at this here. What you see is Part 1 UCR crime total since 2008. Now, that 2008 time frame sound familiar? That's about when we started ILP. And what you see is they're going down steadily. In fact, that 2014 number you see is the lowest we've had for quite some number of years, going back to even before 2008. So that's good news. We like to see that. Now what you're looking at is the crime rate per 1,000 residents. The first one was just raw numbers. This one's telling you what the odds are of you being victimized by a Part 1 UCR crime in any given year. So if you look at that, you can see we were running just under 30, actually it was 29. And by the time we made it to 2014, it was down to 17.1 and then bumped back up a little bit in 2015. Well, that's good to know, but what did we have to do with that? The answer to that is, well, it's really hard to measure. Because here's the deal, you won't find any police administrator who, when crime is going up, says, yeah, it's all our fault. And hopefully you won't find one dumb enough to say, when crime's going down, yeah, we did all that, because you know it's going to turn around at some point. That's what it does. The truth is that Part 1 UCR crimes were dropping over the course of these years anyway nationally. They did not drop as much as they dropped here. We'd like to think we had some role to play in that, but trying to distinguish what that role is for all practical purposes, really expensive / impossible. So we think we had something to do with it because the crime rate fell even more than it did everywhere else, but is it all due to us? No, clearly it's not. This next slide gives you a standard deviation on the raw numbers. Standard deviation is there a statistician here? What are the odds? 68.27% on one standard deviation? Anybody, is that right? Okay. So another way of saying that is 2/3 of the time. If I embarrass myself, you fix me, okay? Because I told you the math part, that's not me. So 2/3 of the time, 68%, you should have numbers falling in that range. Anything outside of that range, now you may want to take a look and see what's going on. And clearly you can see it dropping. In fact, the last 3 years were the lowest we had on record for some time with 2014. I'll be honest, 2014, we were pinching ourselves 3/4 of the way through the year going, wow, what's happening here? I mean, we were firing on all cylinders, everything was working out. It's probably not realistic to expect, here's a standard deviation on the crime rate. I mean, this tells you basically that the population of Riley County hasn't changed much because the charts are pretty much identical. But there's a standard deviation on the crime rate. So again, your chances on an individual basis of being victimized by a Part 1 crime on a year by year, with a year-by-year analysis. So realistically, we don't think that those crime rates, as far as I know, there's no way to get those crime rates down to where they were at that 2014 level and hold them there forever. And even if you do, once you do that, the standard deviation will change if you always calculate it over the same number of years. So our goal is to get it down as low as we can and then keep it there, and in another 5 or 6 years, those red and green lines will move down, and by then, maybe 14, 15, 13, all those numbers will be back within the standard deviations. So it's not going to stay down forever. I don't think you can do that anytime you're talking about historical lows of 2014. And so far this year, actually it was quite alarming to start the year because we had a bunch of Part 1 crime at the first end, most of it driven by larcenies, which is almost always the case. It's the least serious of the Part 1 crimes that really drives the overall Part 1 crime numbers, and that's larceny. They were up, and I think if those rates had continued, it would have been up like 15% this year, but they backed off considerably in the last couple of months, and now we're looking at like 3 and 4% variations, which is not statistically significant. So things look pretty good for us here in Manhattan. It's kind of interesting, we were talking a little bit before the meeting about Topeka and some of the impressions they have down there about crime and what you hear, and fortunately we're not in that position. Again, we'd like to think we had something to do with that, but probably don't deserve sole credit for it. So that takes us to this part. Any questions, anyone? Thoughts? Yes, sir.
We hear a lot about terrorism. 2 questions. One, your capabilities in counterterrorism, and also, secondly, partnerships that you perhaps have with Fort Riley.
Sure. Counterterrorism, not a big role so far. Probably not a big role for us in the future. The main thing we do with respect to the counterterrorism effort on a national level is to communicate information. We get names on the list, for example, that we run across, and there are some, back to the feds, to the FBI. What we are doing locally is we've just now committed, talked to the law board about it in, do you remember what month that was, either one of you? It was 3 or 4 months ago about the JTTF?
Yes, it was 3 or 4 months ago.
Yeah, about 3 or 4 months ago, about having one of our officers, turns out it's a sergeant who is the most qualified, set on the Joint Terrorism Task Force out of Kansas City, and who will actually be working for them pretty much full time now. That gives us access to some information that both he and I can be aware of, but have anybody ever filled out a top secret security clearance? My Lord. They wanted the names of relatives I didn't have. Anyway, so that's all done. We can have access to that information, but we can't spread it around, obviously, because we're getting it by virtue of the top secret clearance. But we're in a position with he and I being there to at least know if something's coming down the pipe and to maybe be able to make some better internal preparations for it without letting the word get out about exactly what it is that's going on. So there's something there, yeah. Yes, sir.
Brad, you suggested that what you were doing with regard to domestic violence wasn't working. Do you have any thoughts on what might work?
I don't, but Rich Fink is working on it right now. He's the commander of the investigations division and the one who hatched that plot. So what he's undertaken is a review this year to determine whether or not programmatically there's anything we can implement next year, but he wanted a year to go through it. So all we know right now is it didn't work and he's working on it. I hit him up 5, 6 weeks ago and he said, yeah, I'm working on it, boss. And I said, okay, that's fine. But I didn't ask him for a lot of details then. Sir?
Speaking about effectiveness of different strategies, I'm wondering about the publication in the newspaper on a monthly basis, maybe of names and photographs of the most wanted for that month.
Right.
Or maybe in the post office. That and maybe in Crime Stoppers. How effective are those? Do you have any way of, can you measure those as being effective programs?
We've done a little bit of work on the most wanted pictures, and we do get, what we found is we get enough interest out of that, and we snag enough people on it that it's worth continuing. And by the way, there's a little bit of confusion about this because people think, oh my gosh, that's the most serious crimes we got in Raleigh County, really? Well, no. What happens is the really serious ones, we know those guys, we know where they are. We either arrest them then, or we get a warrant from the county attorney's office and go get them. Then there's some low-level ones that really don't rise that. So when you see that list, it's really kind of the middle of the pack crew that are on that list, because they get in enough trouble they're worth us paying attention to, but they don't get in so much trouble that it's worth spending a whole lot of resources to find them. And so what we do is we put their picture in the paper, and eventually somebody calls us and we go pick them up. Or they get tired of their picture being there, and relatives always saying it to them. They call us. It happens periodically, more frequently than sporadically, but not as often as we like. What was the other half? Yes,
Well,
about
Crime Stoppers.
Oh, same sort of thing. It kind of depends on the crime. The big stuff tends to get us calls on that eventually, but sometimes the little stuff, we got calls on there was a robbery at a hotel down in the southeast part of town. 6 months later, we got 4 or 5 calls all of a sudden. But that's the way those sort of programs are designed, because invariably what happens with people who commit, there are various classifications of informants, and generally speaking, crooks don't treat each other any better than they treat anybody else. And eventually they hack off the guys who were with them when they did it, and their relatives end up calling us to say, hey, so-and-so, and that's how we solve them. We get a lot of that stuff fairly late on Crime Stoppers, but I'd say it's worth continuing. It doesn't really cost much to do that, so they have a separate board that kind of governs it. There was I saw a couple over here. Yes?
This might be a little bit of a loaded question, so I apologize.
Well, I can duck, that's fine.
I'm on the Social Services Advisory Board
Yes.
in the city, and one of the things that a few of the agencies expressed to us, including Sunflower CASA, is that the RCPD has been bringing more cases to them rather than state agencies have in the past, just due to budget cuts. On these state agencies, have you seen burdens increase on the RCPD?
Have I seen what? Burdens?
Do you, because of state funding, but various agencies, have you seen burdens?
Don't get me started. Yeah. Yes, the short answer is yes. When the state decided they were going to subcontract out to, their DCF was going to subcontract out to, who has it this week? For support services for children and families, the numbers went up. We joke internally about the 4 o'clock fax on Friday, because by statute they've got a set number of time to deal with some of those complaints. If they don't get to them, they fax them over to us, and all of a sudden it becomes our responsibility, unless we tell them we don't have the resources or time to do it. So for a while there, we had a fax war going back, telling them, no, do your own jobs. Because what they would do is they want us to do a criminal investigation over something that probably wasn't criminal, and so we wouldn't have any case to file, but then they'd ask for a copy of it and just turn that in as their report. So that's the sort of thing that's going on, and that's probably just exactly what you're asking about. Yes, sir?
I got 2 things. The first one, you think I was hanging around Scott Emily too long.
I'm sorry.
Good job of catching the guy in camouflage.
Oh, yeah.
The second thing, more serious, I'm curious your comments. In your presentation, you referred in your motto that one of your priorities, reduce crime, and then to target those areas that you can identify as a high crime area. So when I read the paper, it's the area North Baggyville and that trailer park out on Tuttle Creek Boulevard that stands out. But with limited resources, it looks like we're getting ready to spend a ton of money with all kinds of officers in the courthouse, and I never see crimes occurring in the courthouse, but very violent crimes, robberies and muggings on the streets. Can you comment on the logic of directing so many resources inside a courthouse?
Right.
That to me appears much more safe than the areas that you can identify in our community of high crime.
Surely. Okay, here's the way this works. If you look at our crime numbers here and the stuff I just reported, it obviously doesn't justify an increase in officers. So the question that begs then is, the first question that begs is, are we taking away from what we're doing on the street to deal with court security? And the answer is no. Because what happened, and in fact I almost added this as a discussion item on the list, but I figured I'd run out of time. So what happened is, The state of Kansas several years ago said, about 4 years ago, in fact, a little less, said, look, if you want to prevent people from carrying weapons into public buildings, let's limit this discussion to courthouses because it's different for universities, then you need to have a security plan in place. And if you have a security plan in place, you don't have to do anything else until the 1st of 2018. Then there was a Senate bill that passed this year, late in the session, 335, 336, I can't remember, that changed that date from the 1st of 18 to the middle of 17, and also said, now you don't just have to have a security plan in place, you have to have adequate security measures. It also then defined adequate security measures. And the adequate security measures consist of having armed personnel at the entrance and equipment, the kind of stuff you see when you check in an airport, put your bags through, the thing you walk through, the magnetometer, that sort of stuff. There, and it has to be manned. So knowing this was coming and wondering whether or not the county and city would want to keep people from carrying weapons into the courthouse, we engaged them in a discussion quite some time ago. So what both the city and the county, what you're seeing was actually a political decision that says, by governing bodies, it says, we don't want weapons here. Then it evolved into discussion with us because they kind of look at us and say, okay, you guys know about this stuff, what do you think? Our position was, oh, there are different ways you can do this. You could go with private security. There really isn't one in town, so you'd have to, I don't know, contract with somebody from Kansas City maybe and hope they could keep staff out here or something. Or you could have us do it. And if we're going to do it, we'll do the research and figure out what it takes to run an adequate security plan. So what you see and what came up in the budget discussion was the question of what does adequate security cost in terms of personnel. And it's almost all personnel costs. I mean, there's a little bit of cost for the equipment, and there was a good-sized expense by the county for remodeling the county courthouse to facilitate the ingress and the egress area where the court security is going to be going on. And if you've been down there through the county courthouse, you can see where they changed that entrance over there just west of the Wareham. I did remember the Wareham this time. It wasn't the Marriott anymore. So I tell you, I tell you the same thing I told the law board. I'm not a big fan of court security, not because I think it doesn't need to happen, but just because I recognize the burden that puts on the taxpayer, and quite frankly, it's another administrative headache for us to oversee, which is really sort of peripherally a police function. That said, the county or the district judges have the authority to mandate us to do it without taking any of these other steps. And I've been in discussions with the administrative district court judge for 4 years now, where he has graciously said, look, we need to get this done, and since it's coming down the path, I'm willing to wait and make sure it gets done right. So, does anybody like paying that much more for that many more positions? No, I know I probably don't. But if you're going to have court security, then you want to do it right. That's the only way you can do it, given what the legislature did with the language of the statute that controls how you can go about doing court security. And as a quick sidebar to that, one of the things they did, apparently the legislature loves tweaking the judges. The judges have had statutory authority to control their courtrooms all along in terms of carrying weapons. This same Senate bill contained language that said, well, yeah, the judges can control their own courtrooms, but only if the public space is controlled with adequate security measures. Meaning, judges, if you don't have adequate security on the whole building, you can't even keep people from carrying guns into your chambers or into the courtroom itself. I think that's kind of unacceptable. I know I'd be a little uncomfortable with that if I were a judge. But, you know, it is what it is. I saw in yesterday's paper that a judge somewhere in Kansas was taken hostage by someone who didn't like the outcome of a civil case. Now, that was at home. It wasn't at the courthouse.
Garden City.
Was it Garden City? Thank you. I didn't pay attention when I read it to where it was at. So I think they've got some legitimate concerns, and if you're going to have adequate security, the legislature's kind of set the bar for what adequate security is, and we're paying the price for that.
Brad,
Yes, ma'am.
could you discuss the mental health officer that was?
Oh, yes. Well, not an officer, but the position, right. One of the other things included in the budget this year, and this has been an ongoing issue for us, as the state has done with what it has with access to mental health care, which is basically shrink it to almost nothing. We're more and more running into people with mental health issues. The guy I mentioned behind the courthouse is the most recent good example. And we've got nothing we can do with those people. So what we've talked with the board about, and in conjunction with Pawnee Mental Health, they're petitioning the SSAB, he's just left, and we petitioned the law board to fund a couple of positions. As it turns out, and this one would be the case if the board votes on approving that budget at our next meeting, there is money in that budget to hire someone halfway through the year to help us deal with these crisis mental health situations that we encounter out in the field, with the goal of preventing taking those people to jail. And then Robin Cole up at Pawnee Mental Health is trying to do the same thing through SSAB, so we'd have a couple of people to devote to that. Been pretty successful in, I think it was Johnson or Wyandotte counties where it was tried. They had some ungodly number of contacts with people with mental health and only ended up taking 5 or 6 of them. I'm thinking like 1,500 contacts and only ended up taking 5 or 6 of them to jail. So to the extent that could help, that's great. Last time I checked, people with mental health issues in our jail, in terms of a percentage, it usually runs somewhere between the low to mid-teens and upper teens. So think 13 to 19% of the people we have in jail have some sort of mental health issue. So anyway, there's money for that in the 17 budget that it'll kick in halfway through the year. All right?
Brad, thank you.
Thank you.